The Thompson mansion gleamed under the September afternoon sun, its white walls reflecting the light like a solitary beacon atop the most exclusive hill in New York. Inside, William Thompson gazed out the window of his office as his son, Ethan, played in the garden under the watchful eye of Margaret, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for over a decade. Ethan had just turned 6, and his crystalline laughter echoed through the air as he chased after a colorful ball. His light brown hair, so much like his mother's, danced in the wind. William allowed himself a rare smile. Since Eleanor had passed, away 2 years earlier, a victim of a sudden illness, Ethan had become his only safe harbor. "Mr. Thompson?" The voice of his assistant, Patricia, interrupted his thoughts. "The board is waiting for the video conference." William straightened his tie and turned his attention to the computer screen. As the CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the country, he couldn't afford delays. "Of course, go ahead and connect." The meeting stretched on for nearly 2 hours. Numbers, charts, and projections flashed across the screen as William led the discussions with the precision of a conductor. His ability to maintain control was legendary in the corporate world. Nothing escaped his watchful eye. When he finally ended the call, he noticed the sky beginning to take on orange hues. He checked his watch, 5:45 p.m. He still had a few tasks to wrap up, but he decided he could finish them after dinner with Ethan. "Margaret?" he called over the intercom. "Can you bring Ethan inside? It's almost bath time." Silence. "Margaret?" He tried again, furrowing his brow. Nothing. An uneasy feeling began to form in the pit of his stomach. William stood up and walked to the window. The garden, once filled with the joy of his son, was now completely empty. "Margaret!" His voice echoed through the house as he ran down the stairs. "Ethan!" The silence that greeted him was deafening. William hurried through the garden, his heart pounding harder with each step. The colorful ball lay abandoned near the swing, but there was no sign of Ethan or Margaret. "Patricia!" he shouted, and his assistant appeared at the back door, alarmed. "Call security, now!" The next few minutes became a blur of frantic activity. The security team combed every inch of the property. The cameras were checked. The police were called. Neighbors were questioned. Nothing. Ethan had vanished as if he had never existed. Margaret was also nowhere to be found. Her phone was off, and her house, when checked by the police, was empty. Sitting in his office hours later, William stared at a photo of Ethan taken on his birthday just 2 weeks earlier. The boy was smiling, his eyes sparkling as he blew out the candles on his dinosaur-shaped cake. "Sir?" Patricia entered the office, quietly. "The police want to ask a few more questions." William didn't respond immediately. His mind was trapped in a spiral of what-ifs. What if he had ended the meeting earlier? What if I had installed more cameras? What if I had done a more thorough background check on Margaret? "They will find him, Mr. Thompson," Patricia tried to comfort him. "Of course they will," he replied automatically, but his voice was hollow. For the first time in his life, William Thompson, the man who always had everything under control, felt utterly powerless. Night fell over the mansion, bringing with it a silence unlike any those walls had ever witnessed. It was a silence that weighed heavily, that suffocated, that screamed of the absence of a child's laughter that, just a few hours earlier, had filled those spaces with life. In the office, William remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the last image captured by the security cameras. Ethan running after his ball, Margaret a few steps behind, and then nothing. As if the world had simply swallowed his only treasure, leaving behind unanswered questions and a void that seemed endless. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The Thompson mansion, once a symbol of power and success, had become the epicenter of a search that seemed to have no end. William had mobilized immeasurable resources, private investigation teams, security experts, international consultants, everything his money could buy. The office, once meticulously organized, was now covered in maps, reports, and photographs. Every surface told the story of an obsessive search. William barely slept, his eyes constantly checking the screens that displayed the latest investigations, waiting for any crumb of information about his son. "Mr. Thompson," Patricia entered with another stack of reports. "Detective Carter is here for the weekly update." William merely nodded, not taking his eyes off the digital map where red dots marked every location already investigated. Michael Carter, one of the most renowned private investigators in the country, entered the room with his usual leather briefcase under his arm. "Any news?" William's voice sounded hoarse, worn down by time and anxiety. "We followed some leads in North Carolina," Carter began, opening his briefcase. "A child with similar characteristics was seen at a mall in Asheville, but it wasn't him," William finished, running his hands over his tired face, "as if it never is." The silence that followed was interrupted by the sound of the phone. Patricia answered quickly, her face changing expression as she listened. "Mr. Thompson, it's the police. They found Margaret." Augusto's heart raced. Margaret, the housekeeper who had disappeared along with Ethan, was the most crucial link in this story. She had simply vanished on that fateful day, her apartment found empty, her bank accounts untouched. "Where?" His voice came out as an urgent whisper. "At a hotel in Seattle," Patricia replied. She's in a catatonic state. She doesn't respond to any questioning." The news hit Augusto like a punch. After months of searching, the only person who could have answers was unable to provide them. It was as if the universe was mocking his desperation. "I want to see her," he declared, standing up abruptly. "Now." "Sir," Cardoso interjected, "perhaps it would be better to wait. The doctors are—" "Now!" Augusto's shout reverberated through the office walls. "My son is out there somewhere, alone, scared, and the only person who might know where he is can't speak. I won't wait another minute." The next few hours were a blur of movement. The private jet was prepared, and in less than 3 hours, William was at the hospital in Seattle, staring through the glass at the nearly unrecognizable figure of Margaret. The woman who had cared for his son with such tenderness for years was now reduced to a shadow, sitting motionless in a hospital chair, her eyes fixed on an invisible point on the wall. "What happened to her?" he asked the attending physician. "We're still running tests," the doctor replied. "She was found wandering the hotel, completely disoriented. There are no signs of physical violence, but her mental state—" William watched Margaret through the glass, his mind racing with possibilities. What could have happened that day to reduce such a strong person to this state? And more importantly, where was Ethan? Back at the hotel that night, William couldn't sleep. The images of Margaret in the hospital blended with the last memories of Ethan playing in the garden. Something was wrong with this story, something beyond the obvious horror of the disappearance. His phone rang, breaking the silence of the early morning. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" he answered, his voice tense. "Mr. Thompson?" A deep, controlled male voice sounded on the other end. "My name is Daniel Smith. I specialize in missing persons cases, and I think I can help you find your son." William sat up in bed, suddenly alert. "How did you get my number?" "I have my ways," the voice replied. "What matters is that I know things about Ethan's disappearance that no one else knows. And if you want to find him, you're going to need my help." The businessman hesitated, years of negotiation experience making him wary of unsolicited offers. But at this moment, with Margaret in a catatonic state and all other leads exhausted, what choice did he have? "Go on," he finally said, bracing himself for yet another twist in his endless search for answers. Daniel Smith was not what William Thompson had expected. The man who entered his office the next morning had graying hair at his temples and eyes that carried the weight of thousands of untold stories. His simple suit contrasted with the luxurious surroundings of the mansion, but there was something in his demeanor that exuded authority. 23 years in the police, Daniel said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. Specialized in missing persons cases. Retired for 3 years, but some cases still keep me up at night. William watched him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "And why is my case so interesting to you?" "Because," Daniel leaned forward, "your son wasn't taken on impulse. It was a meticulously executed plan, Mr. Thompson, and I've seen this pattern before." The businessman felt a chill run down his spine. "What pattern?" "The disappearance without a trace. The key witness in a catatonic state, the complete absence of a ransom demand. Daniel counted the points on his fingers. It reminds me of a case from 15 years ago. A girl, Emily Johnson. She also disappeared from a garden, and her nanny was found in a similar state to Margaret's. And did you find her? William asked, holding his breath. Daniel's face darkened. No. And that failure haunts me to this day. But I learned a lot from that case, Mr. Thompson, and I can see connections that others are missing in Ethan's case. Patricia entered the office with a tray of coffee, her curious eyes studying the unexpected visitor. Daniel waited for her to leave before continuing. Have you considered that Ethan's disappearance might have been orchestrated by someone close? Someone who knew his routine, his habits, the blind spots of the cameras? William felt his blood run cold. Are you suggesting that someone from my inner circle? I'm suggesting, Daniel interrupted, that we need to look beyond the obvious. Margaret wasn't alone in this. Someone manipulated her, used her as a pawn in a bigger game. The businessman stood up, walking to the window. The garden, once vibrant with Ethan's laughter, now seemed like a silent memorial. I have hundreds of employees, dozens of partners, and how many of them have a reason to hurt you this way? Daniel asked softly. We're not looking for a common criminal, Mr. Thompson. We're looking for someone who wanted to hit you where it hurts the most. Daniel's words sank deep into William's consciousness. In his mind, faces began to parade. Edward Harrison, his former partner, who lost millions when William pushed him out of the company. Marina Collins, the former financial director he fired on suspicion of embezzlement. George Anderson, his childhood friend who drifted away after a fight over investments. How can we be sure? William asked, his voice betraying his anguish. We can't, not yet, Daniel replied, standing up. But I have a theory about Margaret. Her current state isn't natural. Someone broke her psychologically, and we need to find out who and how. And how do we do that? Daniel pulled a small card with an address written on it from his pocket. I know a specialist in psychological trauma. She has methods unconventional, but effective. If anyone can help Margaret recover her memories, it's her. William took the card, studying the address. It was in a remote part of the city, a place he would never have imagined visiting under normal circumstances. When can we start? Tomorrow, Daniel replied. But I need you to understand one thing, Mr. Thompson. From now on, you'll have to trust me completely. No parallel investigators, no external interference. If you want to find your son, you'll have to follow my rules. The businessman stared at the investigator for a long moment. Every instinct in him screamed against the idea of handing over control to someone else. But as he looked at the photo of Ethan on his desk, he knew he had no choice. All right, he finally agreed. Your rules, your method. But if this doesn't work, it will, Daniel interrupted, walking toward the door. Because this time, I won't fail. I can't fail. Emily would never forgive me. As he watched the investigator leave, William couldn't have imagined that he had just taken the first step on a journey that would not only change his search for Ethan, but also his entire understanding of trust, power, and the true meaning of family. The clinic of Dr. Elizabeth Brown lived in an old house on the outskirts of New York. The place, surrounded by ancient trees, felt more like a spiritual retreat than a medical office. William observed the surroundings skeptically as Daniel parked the car. Are you sure about this? He asked, adjusting his tie out of habit. It looks more like a holistic center than a serious clinic. Elizabeth is the best in her field, Daniel replied, turning off the engine. She's worked on complex cases of psychological trauma in various countries. Margaret needs her. The doctor who greeted them was a middle-aged woman, with black hair streaked with natural white and sharp eyes behind thin-framed glasses. Her white lab coat contrasted with the rustic decor of the place. Daniel, she greeted, familiarly. It's been a while, and this must be Mr. Thompson. William shook her hand, noting the firm and professional grip. Doctor, Daniel told me you might be able to help Margaret. Perhaps, she replied, guiding them down a hallway decorated with abstract paintings. But you need to understand something. Margaret's condition is not ordinary. She has built powerful mental barriers, and breaking them down may reveal truths that are hard to face. They entered a spacious room with large windows overlooking a Zen garden. Margaret was seated in a comfortable armchair, her gaze still lost in emptiness. Two nurses monitored her vital signs. "How is she?" Daniel asked. "Physically stable," Elizabeth answered, approaching Margaret. "Mentally, it's as if she's hidden somewhere deep within herself. The question is, what is she hiding from?" The doctor sat across from Margaret, her voice taking on a soft, hypnotic tone. "Margaret, I'm Dr. Elizabeth. I'm here to help." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, Margaret's eyes focused on the doctor's face. "Interesting," Elizabeth murmured. "She's still there, watching. Mr. Thompson, I need your permission to use experimental regression techniques. There is a risk." "Do whatever is necessary," William interrupted. "We just need answers." The following hours were intense. Elizabeth used a combination of hypnosis and exposure therapy, gently guiding Margaret through the barriers her mind had built. At times, the former housekeeper reacted with spasms or low moans as if reliving painful moments. "The garden," Margaret suddenly murmured, her first words in months. "He was in the garden." William stepped forward, but Daniel held him by the arm. Elizabeth continued, her voice calm and controlled. "Yes, Margaret. What did you see in the garden?" "The ball. Ethan was playing with the ball." Tears began to stream down Margaret's face. Then... "So what, Margaret?" Elizabeth insisted softly. "The car. The driver. I knew him. He said it was a message that some people can't be controlled." William felt his blood boil. Who was the driver?" Margaret began to tremble violently. "I can't. He'll hurt my family. He promised." "It's okay." Elizabeth intervened, noticing the signs of extreme stress. "You're safe here." "No, I'm not," Margaret suddenly screamed, her eyes wide with terror. "No one is. He has eyes everywhere. He knows everything. Before she could finish, Margaret convulsed and fainted. The nurses quickly sprang into action, stabilizing her. "That's enough for today," Elizabeth declared firmly. "She needs to rest." Outside the clinic, William paced back and forth, processing what he had just witnessed. "She said she knew the driver. Someone close, as you suspected." Daniel nodded, his face serious. "And someone with enough resources to threaten her family, to maintain constant surveillance." "My partners," William murmured. "I need a list of everyone who has access to the mansion's security systems." "Not just partners," Daniel corrected. "We need to investigate employees, service providers, anyone who might know the routines of the house, and especially..." "What?" "Especially those who would have a reason to send you a message about control. Someone who felt controlled by you in the past, perhaps." William stopped walking, a sudden realization hitting him. "Edward," he whispered. "Edward Harrison. Your former partner?" "Yes. He always said I was obsessed with control. When I pushed him out of the company, his last words were, 'One day you'll learn that you can't control everything.'" Daniel pulled a small notebook from his pocket and made a few notes. "Edward Harrison has just become our prime suspect, but we need to be cautious. If he's really watching Margaret, he must be watching us too," William added, instinctively looking around. "Exactly. From now on, every move needs to be planned. One wrong step and I could lose Ethan forever," William concluded, his heart heavy with the weight of that possibility. Edward Harrison had changed drastically since leaving the company. The man who once frequented the highest business circles in New York now lived secluded in a mansion in Beverly Hills. Daniel and William observed the property from inside their car, parked at a safe distance. "He lost everything after leaving." "The company," William explained, his eyes fixed on the mansion gates. "He tried to compete with me, started a rival company but failed in less than a year. The fortune he had invested simply evaporated." Daniel checked his tablet. "According to my sources, he sold 3 of his 5 properties in recent years, but this mansion, he kept it. And you know what's interesting? The electricity bills show consumption far above normal for someone supposedly living alone." William turned sharply. "How did you get that information?" "I have my contacts," Daniel replied vaguely. "The important thing is that there's constant activity in that house, and more. In the last 6 months, there have been regular transfers, curved large sums to an account in the Cayman Islands. Money to keep someone captive, William murmured, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Possibly, but we need more than suspicions. We need concrete evidence. At that moment, the mansion gates opened. A black car with tinted windows slowly emerged. Daniel quickly photographed the license plate. "It's him," William confirmed. "I recognize the car." "Let's follow him, but from a distance. Edward can't suspect anything." For the next 2 hours, they trailed Edward through the city. He made a few seemingly routine stops, a restaurant, a newsstand, an electronics store, but then something unexpected happened. "He's heading downtown," Daniel observed. "The business district." Edward's car stopped in front of an old building. He got out, glanced around, and quickly went inside. Daniel noted the address. "Interesting," he murmured. "Do you know what operates in that building? A private security company? The same one that provided guards for his mansion at the time of Ethan's disappearance?" William felt a chill run down his spine. "You think—" "I think we just found our connection," Daniel finished. "Edward had a contact inside the security company, someone who could disable cameras, create blind spots. We need to get inside that building." "No," Daniel was firm. "It would be too risky, but I know someone who works in the building's administration. I can get information on who Edward visits regularly." They returned to the Thompson mansion where Patricia was waiting with news. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her face tense. "Doctor." Elizabeth called. Margaret had another episode. She mentioned something about a warehouse and about Edward. William and Daniel exchanged meaningful glances. "What exactly did she say?" Daniel asked. "Something about Edward visiting the warehouse every week, bringing food, toys." William felt his heart race. "Daniel, it means we're on the right track," the investigator finished. "But it also means we need to act with even more caution. If Edward finds out that Margaret is talking, he might do something drastic," William added, a new fear settling in his chest. "We need a plan," Daniel declared. "Something that allows us to follow Edward without raising suspicions. And most importantly, we need to find out where this warehouse is." "What if—" William hesitated, an idea forming in his mind. "What if I offered him a chance to return to the company?" Daniel tilted his head, intrigued. "Go on." "A reconciliation meeting to discuss potential future business. He would never turn down a chance to regain his status. And while he's with me, someone could investigate his property," Daniel added, a smile forming on his face. "Mr. Thompson, you just had a brilliant idea." The Ritz-Carlton restaurant was one of the most exclusive in New York, known for its discretion and privacy. William waited in a private room, adjusting his wristwatch, which concealed a tiny microphone. Daniel monitored everything from a van parked nearby. Testing," William murmured discreetly. "Can you hear me?" "Loud and clear," Daniel's voice responded through the small earpiece. "Remember, stay calm. Edward needs to believe this is just a business dinner." The sommelier had just served the wine when Edward Harrison entered the room. The years had not been kind to him. His face was thinner, with deep bags under his eyes, but his gaze retained its usual shrewdness. "William," he greeted with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I must admit I was surprised by your invitation." "Edward," William stood up, extending his hand. "Please have a seat. Time makes us reflect on many things, doesn't it?" As the two businessmen began their careful dance of words, Daniel and his team moved silently through Edward's property. Using the distraction provided by the dinner, they scoured every inch of the grounds for clues. "The past few years have been interesting," Edward remarked, tasting the wine. "I lost a lot, but I gained perspective. You were always better at business, William. I was too impulsive." "We all make mistakes," William replied, controlling his tone. "Sometimes our decisions have consequences we don't foresee." Through the earpiece, Daniel whispered, "We found something in his office, a folder with photos, and they're from your mansion, William, recent photos." The businessman kept his expression neutral, even as he felt his stomach churn. "You know, Edward, I've been thinking a lot about control lately, about how sometimes The more we try to control something, the more it slips through our fingers, Edward finished, a strange glint in his eyes. Like your son, for example. The silence that followed was as thick as fog. William felt every muscle in his body tense, fighting not to react. I heard about Ethan, Edward continued, his voice low and controlled. It must be distressing, not having control over something so precious. We found it. Daniel's urgent voice came through the phone. A laptop hidden in a safe. There are emails, their coordinates. William, we have proof. Yes, it is distressing, William replied slowly, studying every micro-expression on his former partner's face. But you know what I've learned, Edward, that sometimes we need to let go of the reins to see the truth right in front of us. Edward slightly furrowed his brow. What truth would that be? The truth about who our real friends are. About who would be capable of using an innocent child to seek revenge. William leaned forward. About who would hire people within a security company to create blind spots in a system. Edward's face paled slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. The coordinates lead to a warehouse in San Jose, Daniel informed quickly. We're heading there now. You know what else I found out, Edward? William continued, his voice now laced with a dangerous calm. That Margaret is starting to talk, and she has a lot to say about you. Edward stood up abruptly, knocking over his glass of wine. This is absurd. You have no proof of anything. I have all the proof I need, William replied, also standing up. At this very moment, the police are on their way to your warehouse in San Jose, the one you visit every week, bringing food and toys. Edward's face twisted into a mask of fury and panic. You don't understand, it wasn't supposed to be like this. It was just to make you feel what it's like to lose everything, to lose control like I did. And you used my son for that. William's voice trembled with contained anger. William! Daniel's voice sounded urgent in his ear. We're at the warehouse, but it's empty. Recently evacuated. There are toys, clothes, but Ethan isn't here. Edward smiled, a crooked and unsettling grin. Too late, William, always too late. Some secrets are better kept. Before William could react, Edward bolted for the exit. 2 security guards tried to stop him, but he managed to escape in the chaos, leaving behind only the echo of his laughter and a new mystery to haunt William. If Ethan wasn't in the warehouse, where could he be? The abandoned warehouse revealed more than just empty toys and clothes. Among the items left behind, Daniel found a partially destroyed laptop. On the cracked screen, an email was still open. Transfer complete. GA confirms receipt of the package. GA, Daniel murmured, photographing the screen. George Anderson? William, who had just arrived at the scene, froze upon hearing the name. George was his childhood friend, Ethan's godfather, the man he considered practically a brother. The possibility of his involvement in the scheme was too disturbing to process. Impossible, William shook his head. George wouldn't do this. He loves Ethan like his own son. Sometimes love can turn into something twisted, Daniel replied, examining other documents they had found, especially when mixed with pain and resentment. The words hit William like a punch to the gut. Memories began to surface. The heated argument about investments, the way George accused him of betrayal when William refused to support his project, the look of deep disappointment in his eyes. Mr. Thompson, Patricia rushed into the warehouse. Margaret is lucid. She asked for you. At the hospital, Margaret was sitting on the bed, her hands trembling slightly as she held a cup of tea. Her eyes, once empty, now shone with a frightened clarity. I'm sorry, were her first words when she saw William. I didn't know. They deceived me. They? Daniel asked gently. Margaret, we need to know exactly what happened that day. Margaret took a deep breath. George showed up in the garden. He said he had a surprise for Ethan, a special gift. I didn't suspect he was the godfather, always bringing gifts. Her voice faltered. Then Edward arrived with the car. It all happened so fast. Why didn't you speak up before? William asked, his voice trembling. They threatened my family. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. They showed me pictures of my grandchildren at school, said that if I talked, she shuddered. But I can't keep this secret any longer. Ethan, he needs to come home." "Where is he, Margaret?" Daniel pressed gently. "George has a farm," she whispered, "in the countryside of Minas. Ethan is there. Or was. I don't know anymore." They kept moving him around. William felt the world spin. George, his best friend, the man who comforted him when Eleanor left, who had always been by his side during the toughest times, was one of the architects of his nightmare. "The farm is in Asheville," Margaret continued, "but George isn't acting alone. There are other people involved, people William has hurt over the years, people who—" A noise in the hallway interrupted her. Dr. Elizabeth entered hurriedly. "Margaret needs to rest now. Her blood pressure is rising." "Just one more thing," Daniel insisted. "Margaret, have you seen Ethan since that day? Is he okay?" Margaret nodded slightly. "I saw him chat at once through a video call. They wanted to prove he was alive. He looked different. Older, of course, but well cared for. George," she hesitated. "George treats him as if he were his own son." The revelation hit William with overwhelming force. It wasn't just revenge. It was a twisted attempt by George to create the family he never had by stealing his best friend's son. "I'll assemble a team," Daniel declared, already on the phone. "We need to act fast before they move him again." But William barely heard him. In his mind, he replayed every moment shared with George over the years, every smile, every piece of advice, every moment of apparent friendship. How had he not noticed the signs? How had he not seen the obsession growing, the resentment, turning into something monstrous? "William," Daniel called his attention, "I know it's hard, but we need to focus. George may be your childhood friend, but now he's our prime suspect. And if Margaret is right, he's not alone in this conspiracy." "Who else?" William murmured, more to himself than to Daniel. "Who else have I hurt so much that they'd be part of something like this?" The farm in Asheville was an imposing property, surrounded by lush hills and dense vegetation that made it nearly invisible from the main road. Daniel, observing through binoculars from a nearby hilltop, took detailed notes on the activity at Iku. The site. 6 men patrolling, he informed William, who stood beside him. State-of-the-art security system. George isn't skimping on protection. Patricia, who had insisted on accompanying them, approached with her tablet. "I managed to access the farm's security cameras," she said, surprising the 2 men. "What? I've been working in tech for years. You pick up a few tricks." The footage from the cameras revealed more than they expected. In one of the clips, George appeared talking to an elegant woman in one of the property's gardens. "Marina Collins," William whispered, recognizing his former financial director. "So she's involved too." "And it's not just her," Patricia swiped, her finger across the screen, showing other camera feeds. "Do you recognize that man talking to the security guards? Robert Davis, your former operations manager." William felt his stomach churn. Each familiar face that appeared in the footage was like a stab to the heart. People he had fired, pushed away or simply neglected over the years, all united in an elaborate conspiracy to destroy him. "It's collective revenge," Daniel concluded, observing William's reactions. "Each of them has a personal reason to want to hurt you. George is leading, but they're all actively involved." Movement on the screen caught their attention. A dark van entered the property. When it parked, Edward Harrison got out, looking agitated. "He came straight here after fleeing the restaurant," Daniel noted. "He must be warning the others that we've uncovered the plan." "Wait," Patricia zoomed in on one of the cameras. "Something's happening in the barn." The image showed people moving quickly, carrying suitcases and equipment. "They're preparing to evacuate," Daniel concluded. "They're going to try to move Ethan to another location." "We can't let this happen," William stood up, determined. "We need to act now." "I agree," Daniel was already on the phone. "My team is in position. But William, you need to understand something. When we go in there, you'll see people you once considered friends acting like enemies. Are you prepared for that?" Before William could respond, Patricia let out an exclamation. "Ethan, he's in the backyard garden." On the tablet screen, a teenager was calmly walking among the flowers, accompanied by George. William's heart stopped for a moment. His son, now 14, looked different. Taller, thinner, with features that increasingly resembled Eleanor. But there was something in his gaze, a disturbing serenity that didn't seem natural. "He doesn't look like a prisoner," Patricia observed, confused. "No," Daniel agreed grimly. "He looks like someone who's been convinced he's where he's supposed to be. George didn't just kidnap Ethan, he indoctrinated him all these years." The realization hit William like a bolt of lightning. It wouldn't be enough to simply rescue Ethan. His son had spent the last 8 years being fed lies about him, shaped to believe in a distorted version of reality. "How do I win back his trust?" William asked, his voice choked. "One step at a time," Daniel replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "First, we get him out of here. Then with patience and love, you'll have to show him who you really are, not who they said you were." On the screen, Ethan looked directly into one of the cameras, as if he could sense he was being watched. For a brief moment, William saw a flicker of something in his eyes, doubt perhaps, hope, before George guided him back inside the house. The operation began at dusk. While Daniel's team strategically positioned themselves around the estate, William did something unexpected. He walked alone to the main gate and rang the doorbell. "What is he doing?" Patricia whispered over the communicator. "Exactly what needs to be done," Daniel replied, watching the scene from his elevated position. "He's facing his demons head-on." George was the one who answered the intercom. There was a tense moment of silence before his voice came through, laced with irony. "Finally, we meet, old friend." The gate slowly opened. William walked down the tree-lined driveway leading to the main house, each step echoing with the weight of years of regret and revelations. On the porch, George waited for him, an enigmatic smile on his face. "You took longer than I expected to find us," George remarked casually, as if they were at one of their old social gatherings. "Where is my son?" William asked, his voice controlled. "Your son?" George laughed bitterly. "You lost the right to call him that a long time ago, William. Ethan has a new family now, people who truly care about him." At that moment, other familiar faces began to appear. Marina Collins, Robert Davis, Edward Harrison, all converging on the porch like actors taking their places in the final act of a long and complex play. "Why?" William asked, looking at each of them. "Why do this? Why?" Marina stepped forward, her eyes blazing with contained anger. "Because you destroyed our lives, William. Each of us dedicated years to you, to your company, to your dreams. And how did you repay us? You discarded us," Robert added, "like defective parts of a machine." "You never understood the true value of people," Edward chimed in. "You only saw numbers, results, control." "And I," George spoke up again, "your best friend, was forced to watch as you turned into a power-obsessed monster. When Eleanor was sick, where were you? In business meetings. When Ethan cried for attention, what did you do? You checked financial reports." The truth of each accusation struck William like precise arrows. But before he could respond, a young voice sounded from the door. "Dad?" Ethan was there, watching the scene with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. 8 years had passed, but in that moment, father and son truly recognized each other for the first time. "Ethan," William whispered, taking a step toward him. "Don't come closer," George ordered, stepping between them. "Ethan, go inside. This isn't something you need to see." "No," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "I need to see, I need to understand." "There's nothing to understand," George insisted. "Your father is a man who made mistakes," William interrupted, his gaze fixed on Ethan. "Many mistakes, with all of you, but especially with you, son. And I've spent every day of the last 8 years trying to make it right." Ethan took a step forward, ignoring George's silent protest. "Uncle George told me stories about you, about how you were obsessed with control, how you neglected people." "And he was right," William admitted, surprising everyone. "I was like that. But losing you, it changed me. It made me see what really matters." At that moment, Daniel gave the signal. His team emerged from the shadows, surrounding the house. The conspirators, realizing they were cornered, reacted in different ways. Edward tried to run, Marina began to cry, Robert froze. But George remained calm, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "Everything we did," he said softly, "was to protect you, Ethan. To give you the family you deserved. Protect me? Ethan questioned, his voice trembling slightly. By keeping me away from my father? By feeding me lies and bitterness for 8 years? Ethan, George tried again, but the teenager interrupted. Him. You said my father only cared about control, Ethan continued, looking at each of the conspirators. But don't you realize you did the exact same thing? You controlled my life, my memories, my feelings. The silence that followed Ethan's words was deafening. George, who for so long had convinced himself of his own righteousness, seemed to have aged decades in just a few minutes. The other conspirators, one by one, lowered their heads, the weight of their actions finally hitting them with full force. All these years, Ethan continued, his voice gaining strength, you told me my father was a man obsessed with power, who didn't care about anyone but himself. But you know what I see now? I see a man who never gave up looking for me, who transformed his entire life trying to find me. William took a step toward his son, and this time no one tried to stop him. Ethan, No, Ethan raised his hand, cutting him off. I need to say this. Uncle George told me stories about how absent you were, how you ignored the people around you. And maybe that was true. But he never told me about the times you cancelled meetings to come to my school performances, or how you read me stories every night no matter how tired you were. Tears now streamed freely down William's face, memories he had kept buried deep in his heart, precious moments that had kept him sane during the long years of searching. I found your old journals, Ethan revealed, surprising everyone. The ones Mom kept. I read about your struggles, your fears, your love for us. I read about how you tried to balance everything, even if you didn't always succeed. George stepped forward, his voice trembling. Ethan, we just wanted to give me a family, Ethan finished, turning to him. You were my godfather, Uncle George. You were already my family, all of you were. But you chose to turn pain into revenge, and you used me as a tool. Daniel and his team began to move closer, ready to make the necessary arrests. But before they could act, Ethan did something unexpected. He hugged George. I love you, Uncle. George, he said softly, I always will. You took care of me, raised me, protected me. But what you did, it was wrong. And now I need to go back home, my real home. The hug lasted only a few seconds, but it carried the weight of 8 years of love, distorted by resentment. When Ethan stepped back, George didn't resist, as the agents led him away. One by one, the conspirators were taken. There was no resistance, no attempts to escape. It was as if the truth in Ethan's words had finally shattered the illusion they had built over the years. Father and son were left alone on the porch, the silence of the night broken only by the distant sounds of nature. There was so much to say, so many wounds to heal, so much lost time to recover. It's not going to be easy, Ethan finally said, looking at his father. 8 years is a long time. I know, William replied softly. But we have time now, all the time in the world. Have you really changed? Ethan asked, his eyes searching for truth in his father's. Losing you taught me the hardest lesson of my life, William answered. I learned that control is an illusion, that people, relationships, love are the only things that truly matter. Ethan nodded slowly, then gave a small smile, the first William had seen in 8 long years. I think we both have a lot to learn from each other. As they walked together toward the car, leaving behind the farm that had been both a prison and a refuge, father and son began to forge a new path. It wouldn't be an easy journey. There were deep scars, painful memories, and a lot of trust to rebuild. But there was also hope, the same hope that had kept William searching for 8 years, the same hope that had allowed Ethan to keep the memory of his true father alive, beyond the stories he had been told. On the horizon, the first rays of sunlight began to appear, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. It was a new day, a fresh start, and this time neither father nor son was willing to waste a single moment together.